World History Discussions, Chapter 6, Part 4. So we just discussed the Olmecs, which were that civilization right there, and they went into decline between 400 and 100 BCE. However, after their fall, human population continued to grow dramatically, and ceremonial centers cropped up in sites far removed from the Olmecs, one of the most important of which was right here, the Mayan society. The early Mayan capital was at Juyu, which is around modern-day Guatemala City. And that was where the Mayans were between 200 BCE and 300 CE. This had fertile soil and excellent farming conditions, and like the earlier Olmec cities, Juyu was a ceremonial center rather than a true city, but it dominated the life of the surrounding communities. However, it declined around 300 CE when it fell under the economic and perhaps political dominance of Teotihuacan over 800 miles away in modern Mexico City. So now I'll show you a modern map of that. That's what I was saving this for. So here is the distance from Mexico City to Guatemala City. You can see it's about 800 miles, and yet Teotihuacan was about 30 miles to the east of Mexico City, had such influence that it basically caused the early Mayan capital of Juyu to go into decline. However, the Mayans were about to be at their height. See, there's reservation of the Maya. So basically, northern Guatemala of today is where the Mayans moved to, going up north to Tikal. And Tikal is where classical Maya was, or the Mayans at their height, between the year 300 and the year 800. So you can see that going back to this map, that they moved from Juyu to Tikal, but Tikal is peak Mayan. So now you're about 300 miles north of Juyu, because I will go to another map here. You know I love my maps. This is kind of where all the Mayan capitals were, and this map bypasses it because Tikal is somewhere in here, as I said, and then eventually Chichen Itza, which is up around here, but it's about 600 miles through all this territory of Guatemala and the Mexican Yucatan Peninsula. And so Tikal is about 300 miles north of Juyu and about 300 miles south of Chichen Itza. I just wanted to show you that on the modern map, that this is a pretty good chunk of land, about 600 miles worth that we're talking about. Trying to show you the size and the depth of these civilizations. Anyway, the disadvantage to moving from Juyu to Tikal was that this was much lower. You could also see in both maps there's a lot of mountains in here in Juyu, but then Tikal is in the flatlands, and this meant the tropical soils quickly lose their fertility, but the Mayans built terraces to trap silt and artificially retain rich soil for agriculture, and they cultivated maize and cotton, raising cacao beans, which were mostly consumed by the nobles. Cacao beans actually served as money. There were over 80 large ceremonial centers built between 300 and 900 CE, with pyramids, palaces, and temples. Like I say, Tikal is classical Maya. That's peak Maya from about 300 to 700 CE, like I say. And you had 50,000 inhabitants in Tikal alone, and about 50,000 more in the surrounding countryside. In other words, about 100,000 total. Enormous paved plazas and scores of temples, pyramids, and palaces. Temple of the Giant Jaguar was 154 feet tall and meant to symbolize Tikal's control over the surrounding population, which I mentioned was about 500,000. Tikal was the largest Mayan kingdom, but there were other smaller ones that existed too, like Chichen Itza and Palenque further north, which you can see right there, and Palenque further to the west. Anyway, just like in our catchy opener, Palenque is where that king was from. But you had 10 to 30,000 people in each of those smaller kingdoms too, and jaguar was a major symbol of power due to being a top forest predator. Many kingdoms were at war with each other too, and victors would destroy conquered civilizations and take over their temples. More on that in the very next video.